for a job, and he's talking about how he's got 20 years of, well, he's been there as long as I've been there at the Starbucks, or at the McDonald's here. And the guy, he's trying real hard to sell himself, but he's doing a lot of talking. And of course, when you're talking to a general manager, found out the guy who I was telling you all about, he is the general manager here. Apparently he's the GM of more than one store. And the guy who's applying for a job is trying to get a GM position. Well, they've got maybe some lower positions for him, but the GM isn't going to be replacing himself. And as far as appointing this man to a higher position, well, he just doesn't have the pay grade. Anyway, even though I'm allowed to be there for 2 hours, I am not going to butt heads with the GM. It's easier for me to just leave. However, this guy that was trying to sell himself, he basically just sat there and talked about how he had bought into a restaurant at 20% of the business, and then the business was driven into the ground immediately. And then this guy wants to talk about how he's served over 1 million meals and a bunch of other stuff like this. And I'm like, not at a 20% buy-in when your business closes immediately. So maybe he's got a long work history that they have written down and got to see. Maybe he don't. They were talking about how he hadn't had a job for a while, so maybe he retired and realized that there ain't no way in hell he's gonna be able to survive on retirement money. Then, of course, try to talk himself up a bit, increase his clout. He wanted to talk about being a police officer. Now, he's obviously not any good at his job as a police officer. He's talking to a GM who's got gang tattoos on his fucking head, for Christ's sake. Yeah, telling him you used to be a cop probably isn't going to get you very many brownie points. Neither is talking about how you served 1 million meals out of a company who had a 20% buy-in that was shut down immediately. Because of pre-existing problems from the 1980s. Like when this guy bought into the business, it apparently was going to be thrashed anyway because of something that happened 20 years ago. Who's going to believe that stuff? Doesn't matter if you believe it. They don't need a general manager. They don't even need a manager. They might need a shift manager or a shift super. I don't even think they need that. What they need is fucking burger flippers. When the lady who's running the front cashier is also running 2 of the machines as far as making the food, and then 3 of the machines as far as the drinks and Frosties and all that crap goes. And she has to go back and forth between that position and the drive-thru. Yeah, they don't need another fucking manager. They need more grunts on the ground. They need more boots where it counts. Too many generals, not enough soldiers. It's also a matter of knowing who you're talking to. Now, this guy, he wants to talk about his experience as a police officer. Obviously, he was not any good at his job as a police officer. And obviously, he wasn't any good at his job of being a general manager of his own restaurant. So, basically, he's telling them about a bunch of stuff that he's done that doesn't really fit in with what they're looking for at McDonald's. Maybe they need somebody to do paperwork. Maybe he can get that position. But they're going to want to see something successful before they're going to hire you. And he's talked about 3 or 4 different businesses that were shut down right after he got involved. Yeah, McDonald's is hopefully smart enough not to get tangled up in a situation like that. Especially with a guy who is claiming that he used to be a police officer, because then he's probably got connections and he's probably gotten away with whatever stupidity he's pulled. He's probably gotten away with it more than once. Now then there's the talking trash on younger folks. That's pretty common among older folks, isn't it? All these youngins, they're all lazy, they're all this and they're all that. I'm like, you kidding me? You got some security in the fact that your house was locked in 1978. Things were a lot cheaper then. Now these kids ain't got those options. Everything is 10 times more than it cost back then, and that is literal. Has our minimum wage, how much is it increased? Is it matching the amount of money that we're spending on goods? A lot of people want to tell me about how in Mexico they only make $10 American per day. And then you look at the fact that you can get, I've had many people tell me this, dude, you can still get a Coca-Cola, full-size Coca-Cola for 15 cents in Mexico. 15 cents American. Now, when you do the hourly rate on that versus what are we paying here on average, 20-ounce Coca-Cola, 20-ounce Mountain Dew, over $2 average in most of the country for 20 ounces. That's not a big one, is it? How many hours you got to work for the amount that you're getting and the amount that you're paying out? One guy here was telling me, where I'm from in Mexico, it costs about 7 cents, 7 or 8 cents. He did the little math on his calculator. He said it's about 7 or 8 cents where I come from to buy a soda pop. 7 or 8. Well, he figures it out as far as pesos go. So between 7 and 8 means that, well, what does that mean? I don't understand how the Mexican peso system works or how it works compared to American system of money. I don't know exactly what the exchange rate is, which is why that feller having it on his phone and looking it up was useful. I also made sure that because the GM is here and he's the one guy that don't like me, he talks to me nice. Of course, he wants to carry his voice and make sure his voice is carried. I can do that too. I choose not to. I know that according to the policies of McDonald's, I have 2 hours after purchasing a coffee where I'm allowed to hang out. I'm allowed to plug in my computer. I'm allowed to do, well, I'm allowed to get free refills even. So the other day when I was buying another coffee, every hour or so, I didn't actually have to do that. But I did so just so I wouldn't be targeted, or in the hopes that I wouldn't be targeted. I also did not know about the refill policy here, or how long I was allowed to hang out. One of the ladies here was talking about college students coming in and sitting down for sometimes 6 or 8 hours to do a report. Now there's a lot of students that come in with their computers and do that. It's not offensive for somebody who looks like they might live in a house to come in and sit with their computer and do that. But if someone looks unsightly, then obviously they're only trying to take advantage of you because they're unsightly. They're only trying to take advantage of your business because you're unsightly. But the reality is, it's a change in rules depending on who it is, depending on the social class. I don't go in there starting problems. I don't go in there to light the place on fire. I don't go in there to insult the people that work there. I don't go there to throw coffee at them or anything of that nature. But I also know that when it comes to living in such a fucked up and superficial world, we got people that want to try to get jobs based on bias. I mean, he's trying to sell his bias to the manager and to the general manager here as reasons why he should have his job. He's also using businesses that were all run into the ground as a reason why he should have a job as a GM. They need burger flippers. They'll hire you on at $16 to $17 an hour just to flip burgers. Literally just for flipping burgers. I shouldn't say literally, because there is more to it than just flipping burgers. You gotta know how to make the sandwiches. But they need grunts. See, that's how we got in such a screwed up situation. We started paying the grunt labor less and tried to put a lot more importance on the managerial positions. Everybody wants to be a fucking manager. Everyone wants to be a general. Nobody wants to be an infantryman. Meanwhile, how do you get to be a good general? You start off in the goddamn infantry. It's the grunts on the ground that win wars. It's not the tanks. It's not the airplanes. Sure, they can bomb the hell out of you or use the surface fleet and shell the shit out of your positions, shell the shit out of your cities, shell the shit out of whatever the hell they want, but without an occupying force. That's grunts on the ground. None of it makes any difference. And then there's also the hearts and the minds of the people. Where did we lose in Vietnam? The hearts and minds of the people. We were so afraid of communism and the spread of communism that we got involved in French colloquialism and empire. Well, those empires don't deserve to exist in those places. The Dutch should not have any holdings in East Asia. Neither should the French, neither should the Americans, neither should the British. What y'all don't want to take a look at is this empire. These are all subjugated people. What you guys want to throw on the United States, Great Britain especially, wants to forget all of their terror, all of their evils, an entire history of carnage and slaughter and slavery, wholesale. Even after 1066, when slavery was made illegal in Great Britain, on the island itself. But somehow, they still had Irish slaves, still had Dutch slaves and French slaves. Who started the slave trade between Africa and the United States? Queen Elizabeth I. That was well after 1066. Now let's take a look at India. How is India subjugated? Through murder and oppression. How is Vietnam subjugated? Murder and oppression. Of course, those are two different nations, aren't they? Two different allied nations to the United States during World War II. Sort of. We didn't get involved in World War II until after France had already capitulated. And, of course, many of them were on the German side. Not because they were German nationals or because they believed in the Nazi cause, but because they didn't want their families getting their goddamn brains blown out in front of everybody. They didn't want to be marched to a bridge, tied up with heavy chains. You shoot one of them in the head and kick them into the water, they drag everybody else down with them. When it comes to generals, we take a look at what we're getting, how the working class people are getting paid less and less compared to their expenses. That's because we've got too many generals expecting too much. One general getting $100,000 a year. That almost makes sense. When we're having to pay for 60 generals $100,000 a year, plus all of their expenses, well, that's a lot of infantrymen, a lot of boots on the ground that aren't going to be of any use. You're too busy paying the generals. Meanwhile, $100,000 a year is not considered a whole hell of a lot by a lot of people. Oh, you only make $100,000 a year? Shit. I'll be lucky if I make $10,000 a year. And even with that, it's all spent before I ever get it. Trying to live on $800 a month when it costs $3,200 a month on average, just to try to keep a roof over your head. $3,200 a month. That's insanity. Why are you going to expect poor people to pay literally $400 a month in insurance? Is that fucking stupid or what? You say, oh, well, there's this free insurance. And you go in and you fill it out and they tell you that you earned $11 too much last year. Or, of course, they want to look at the amount that you were paid before taxes. This is how much you're actually earning. And then they don't take a look at the fact that you had to work a bunch of overtime hours to try to pay your child care. And after working all them overtime hours, you're now making $10,000 less. You're now having to pay almost $10,000 worth of taxes more than you would have because you worked a few too many hours. So literally, you're working yourself into poverty like a fucking moron. Oh yeah, all I gotta do is work harder. All you gotta do is work harder. All you gotta do is get a job. You just need to get a better job. Well, what about getting a job and sticking with it, right? Doesn't that show loyalty? Loyalty to the company? Your thankfulness for having the job? You're supposed to be grateful, right? Well, what if you've been working in this job for 6 or 7 years? You're still making $8 an hour. And then somebody else comes along and says, hey, I'll pay you $12.50 an hour to come cut wood with me or to come chop metal with me. One guy I worked for, his name was Gary Smith. He was a metal scrapper. I love that job. If that guy had actually paid me on time, I'd say that was probably the favorite job I ever had. But tree cutting was the favorite job I ever had, even though it was $7.50 an hour is all I got paid. I wasn't the tree cutter, I was the lumper most of the time, or the guy who gas and oiled the saws. If there was weekend projects, well, I was the one that got called out for them. Most of the time, it'd be a sewer situation. As soon as the guy I worked for, Gary Jeffson, he was the one that I did the tree cutting with. When he changed over so that his kids were all getting salary for working for him. Well, they're making over $2,000 a month salary. And when they were getting salary, they get paid that no matter what. So when Gary Jeffson gets a call at 1:30 in the morning that he needs to go out and clear out somebody's sewer emergency like, they're not going to go out. So what does he do? He calls me and I show up. Oh, until I screwed up my back anyway. Now that job with Gary Smith, the thing that sucked about that is how much it cost me to work for him. I mean, here I am, I'm waiting on a $400 paycheck because he's only able to pay me half my wages. He's supposed to pay me every 2 weeks. He's only giving me a $400 paycheck out of the $800 that he owes me. And it takes him 2 weeks to get that. He says the other money is supposed to be like, basically like a buy-in to the company that I did not agree with. He changed the deal. Lots of people do that. When they assume that you're a retard and they know you ain't got the money to fucking sue them, they do whatever the hell they want. It's your word versus theirs. Who fucking cares? You're the hobo. They're the business owner. They have rights. You fucking don't. Now that's the difference between Gary Smith and Gary Jeffson. Gary Jeffson paid. He always paid. Gary Smith wanted to decide, well, you know, I agreed to hire you on at 15 an hour, but I'm only going to pay you half of that. I'm going to pretend that the other half is for a buy-in in this company that obviously my employee don't want any part of. But Gary Smith was spending a lot of money on alcohol, a whole lot of money on alcohol. It's difficult to run a business when you're fucking drunk. It's difficult to keep employees when you don't pay them. But how was I going to take Gary to court? One of those bills, just one bill, that I needed that money for so I could pay that bill. It ended up costing me over $200 extra in addition to the bill because he didn't pay me on time. Meanwhile, he's not paying me enough to live on for 2 fucking weeks to get to the next fucking paycheck. So then he's also still expecting me to go to work on empty promises. He promises he'll pay me. He just needs me to work. He really needs to get this project done, and he really needs to get that project done. As soon as the project is done, he's going to get paid cash, and as soon as he gets paid that cash, he's going to pay me right away, and then he gets paid that cash. He literally went out and bought like 8 24-packs of booze, 8 24-packs of alcohol so that he could go drinking. He bought some extra machines that were not necessary. One of the machines that he bought, all right, he's telling me that he doesn't even have enough money to feed himself, right? So the reason that he hasn't paid me yet is because he doesn't even have food. His girlfriend at the time, her name is Heather. She's telling me, yeah, we got food. We're living off me and him aren't married and we're not technically living together. So I get my disability money or my government money for being a single mom. I get the food stamps and we live on that. That's more than enough because we got a place to cook it. All right. Well, he's saying that he can't pay me because you guys don't have any food. And she did give me the lowdown about how he and the guy that started the company with him, Jeff, were both alcoholics, and that's where a lot of their money goes. But they're going to work. They are working, and, they are able to work. And since I was working for him, she was going to go talk to Gary and explain to him, hey, that he's got to live on something. When you tell him that you're going to pay him at the end of 2 weeks and you're going to pay him $800, because that's how many wages he's supposed to have at $15 an hour. Meanwhile, I'm doing all the grunt work out there because Jeff is old. I mean, for him, he shows up, he drinks on the tailgate and watches a while. And sometimes he comes off of it and goes and cuts with the torch a little bit. And then he goes back to sitting on the tailgate. It leaves it up to me and Gary to try to get the actual work done. But Gary, he's always got to make trips. As far as being prepared, chance favors the prepared mind. But somebody who's depriving themselves of alcohol by drinking all the time isn't going to be prepared. When I was working with Gary Jeffson, it was very rare that we had to send somebody back to the shop to get anything. With Gary Smith, it was just like working with David Roop. David Roop may know his job, he may know carpentry extremely well, but when he's spending 90% of his time off the job site, having to go spend an hour to 2 hours per trip, like when we were working in Ogallala, for example. The lumberyard is literally 10 minutes away. So it's 10 minutes there and 10 minutes back, 40 minutes to find what it is that he needs to find, and then he can come back. Well, when he's gone for 2 or 3 hours, did it really take you 2 to 3 hours to find a carpenter's pencil? Meanwhile, when you've got one of your employees who literally brought an entire box of carpenter's pencils, that being Toby Smith, when he brings an entire box of carpenter's pencils and tells you, yeah, these are for the job site. I brought these because they've been sitting in a drawer for forever and a fucking day. We have carpenter's pencils. You don't need to go into town for them. But Stretch, he's a stoner. And really what he wanted to do is, while we were doing the work, and he was getting paid for the work, and he was charging them for having 3 people there working on the house, and he was the boss, he repeatedly left me and Toby Smith there doing the work. And then he'd come back and he would complain about what we were doing. We were working on a deck. I screwed in the screws on the deck like he had asked me to. And here's the thing about Stretch. He'll place himself right where you're working. I mean, literally, I had 6 screws left to screw in. That's it. Stretch shows up, has me move from where I'm screwing in the screws. This is the last area where I got to screw them in. And he tells me, all right, well, finish up the deck. I expected to be done by the time I got back. Well, you expected whatever the hell you wanted. But the thing is that you thought me and Toby Smith were both going to be screwing in stuff into that deck, where obviously Toby Smith was doing something else. And that's not to say that Toby Smith wasn't doing his job. He absolutely was. When the homeowner comes out and tells Toby Smith, hey, these boards are not lined up. Now, who is it that placed all of those boards? That was Stretch. Stretch did the cutting. Stretch did the placing. He'd have one of us hold it, and then he would drill 2 or 3 screws into this entire, deck beam. Maybe 2 or 3 screws in it just to hold it in place. But he wasn't paying attention to how it looked. He wasn't looking at the gap spacing. He wasn't trying to line anything up. David Roop knows his shit when it comes to carpentry. He just wasn't applying it. And then after he'd get all stoned and fuck something up, and then he'd leave so he could come back and it would be me and Toby Smith's fault somehow. Well, no, Toby Smith was like, all right, the homeowner came out and bitched at us about this. If we screw everything in like Stretch told us to, looking this way, it's not just going to look bad on him, it's going to look bad on us, and we're also going to be the ones that Stretch is bitching at. So he set about pulling all but one of those out. Usually there was only 2 or 3 of them holding it in place. And he was unscrewing them, and he had this little gauge. It was just a block of wood. He'd slide it in there. If the block of wood slid in there, then he knew it was right. So he'd put the block of wood in there, and he'd push it, and he'd screw it down. And then I'm supposed to go back over it. So I have to wait for him for the first 2 or 3 rows where it's coming actually into a corner. So when Toby Smith does that, we literally have to do this to the entire deck. And Stretch didn't show back up for 5 hours. 5 hours. He's expecting the job is going to be done by the time he gets back. But it's not done by the time he gets back because he didn't do it right. He knew the right way to do it and didn't do it right. Just like Gary Smith. He knew how to do it right. He just didn't do it right. He didn't stop to consider what it cost me to have to wait on him to pay me. Or the fact that I was burning through all those calories. And then, of course, he was telling me, well, if you're going to work for me, I may not have the best wages, but I'll always feed you. And then he wouldn't. He even yelled at me one day because this is like the third day that he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go into town. I know I promised you that I'd make sure you were fed until you get your first paycheck and all that. But you really need to find something to do after work to get a little bit of money." Well, now you're changing the deal on it. Everybody feels like it's their place to change the deal to whatever is useful for them. They don't care about their employees. They care about profits. They care about keeping their jobs. Fuck it. Oh, come on now. You know how we end these videos. Good to be rid of you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper, and no victim left behind. Not even if they were conquered by Great Britain by force. Great Britain has a longer history of destroying lives, a longer history of destroying native populations, a longer history of spreading disease, a longer history of the worst atrocities ever committed by humankind. British history makes Nazi Germany look like a troop of Boy Scouts. Great Britain, both before and after World War II, showed itself to be exactly like the Nazis. Exactly like the Native Americans that Brits want to point out so much. Oh, well, look what the Americans did with the Native Americans. Well, look what the Brits did with Native Americans. Look what the Brits did with Indians from India. Look what the Brits did with Aborigines from where? Australia. Look at what the Brits did with the slave trade in Africa. Look what the Brits did with the slave trade in the Polynesian Islands, in the Malaysian Islands, in the Indies, and in Asia itself. What right did Great Britain have to subjugate all of these peoples? What right did they have to force horrible atrocities upon these people and tell them that it's their fault for not becoming Christian, for not becoming Protestant, for not becoming British? The whole British Empire is built on the idea of either you let British people kill you or the British people will kill you more. Either you work yourself to death for a bunch of people who don't give a shit about you, or you and your family can be worked to death for a country that doesn't care about you. How many of the Indian subjects, I'm talking about actual India, how many of them had ever been to Britain? Probably not very many. How much did Parliament give a shit about India? How about the Berbers? All governments are wrong. People are people, regardless of color, regardless of gender, regardless of nation of origin.